You're falling. Not the way you practiced, not the clean exit from the door, the static line pulling, the canopy opening above you like a promise kept. This is wrong from the first second. The aircraft is banking too hard. The flak is everywhere. And by the time you clear the door, you already know you're not where you're supposed to be. The ground is coming up fast, and it's dark, and it's France, and you don't speak French, and somewhere below you, a war is waiting that doesn't care about any of that. You pull the reserve anyway. This is your story. You land hard, harder than training, harder than the dozen practice jumps that were supposed to prepare you for this, and the impact drives through your ankles and knees, and you roll the way they taught you. Except the ground here isn't the flat Georgia dirt of Camp Toccoa. It's a Norman field with a hedgerow on 3 sides, and something that might be a farmhouse on the 4th. And when you come to a stop, you're lying face down in wet French grass at 1:30 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944, and you have absolutely no idea where you are. You lie still for 30 seconds. This is procedure. Secure your weapon. Check yourself for injury. Assess the immediate area. Your rifle is still with you, which is the first good thing that's happened since you left England. Your left knee hurts in a way that's probably bruising and not something worse, which is the second. Everything else is noise and fire and the sound of aircraft somewhere above you that are already moving away, leaving you behind in a country that's been occupied for 4 years by people who will shoot you on sight. Your name is James Callahan. Everyone calls you Jimmy. You're 19 years old. You're from Cincinnati, Ohio. You worked at the steel mill for 11 months before you enlisted, and you've been in the Army for 14 months. In the 101st Airborne for 8. And right now, all of that feels like information about a different person in a different life. The farmhouse across the field has a light in one window, a small, careful light, the kind people keep when they're trying not to be noticed. You watch it for a long time. It could be a French family. It could be Germans. It could be other paratroopers who found shelter before you. The field manual has guidance on a lot of things, but not on this specific uncertainty, at this specific hour, in this specific field, in Normandy. Somewhere to the east you think east, you hope east. There's the sound of small arms fire, then silence, then more. The sounds of June 6th settling into their pattern around you, a pattern you don't know yet, but will know completely by this time tomorrow, assuming you're still here to know it. You get to your feet carefully. Check the compass, the luminous needle swinging and steadying, pointing north. You orient yourself. The drop zone was supposed to be 4 miles west of Sainte-Mère-Église. You have no way of knowing how far off course the aircraft took you before you jumped, which means you have no way of knowing how far you are from anyone who's supposed to be here with you. You're alone in a French field at 1:30 in the morning. You start walking toward the sound of the guns. You grew up on Elm Street, which sounds like something from a story, and in a way, it was a narrow street of identical row houses in the west end of Cincinnati, where everybody's father worked at one of the mills or one of the plants, and everybody's mother knew everybody else's business, and the summers were long and humid and smelled of the Ohio River, and the winters were gray and specific in the way that Midwestern winters are specific, not dramatic, just present, just cold, just there. Your father worked at the Cincinnati Milling Machine Company for 22 years. Your mother kept the house and raised you and your 2 sisters and made a pot roast every Sunday that you've thought about more times in the last 8 months than in the previous 19 years combined. You were not a complicated child. You liked baseball and fixing things and the particular freedom of a summer afternoon with nothing required of you until dinner. You were not the kind of kid who dreamed of adventure or glory, or anything larger than what Elm Street offered, which was enough, which was exactly the right size. The war arrived the way it arrived for everyone: a Sunday, a radio, your father's face doing something you'd never seen it do before. A stillness that wasn't his usual stillness, but something different, something that understood, something you didn't yet. You were 16. You listened to the broadcast and felt the way you felt, at the edge of something large, without being able to see its shape. You enlisted the week after your 18th birthday. Your mother cried in the kitchen, where she thought you couldn't hear her. Your father shook your hand, the same handshake he'd been giving you since you were 12, firm and brief, and meaning more than it said, and drove you to the induction center without turning on the radio. Your sisters stood in the doorway and waved until the car turned the corner. You looked back until you couldn't see them anymore. Basic training at Camp Toccoa was the hardest thing you'd ever done, and also, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the most alive you'd ever felt. Which was a contradiction you didn't spend much time on, because you didn't have much time. The running Currahee Mountain, 3 miles up and 3 miles down, became something you did the way you breathed, automatically, grimly, without thinking too far ahead. You learned that your body could do more than you believed it could, and that belief was the actual limiting factor, not muscle or lung. You volunteered for Airborne because the extra $50 a month mattered, which is the unglamorous truth that nobody puts in the recruitment posters. You stayed for Airborne because somewhere in the first 3 weeks of jump school, you understood that you'd found your people, men who chose the harder thing, who jumped out of perfectly good aircraft into darkness and trusted the equipment and each other and nothing else. Your first real jump was over England, a training exercise, broad daylight, the English countryside laid out below you like a map of somewhere safe. You remember thinking, this is what the world looks like from outside it. This is the view from a place where nothing can touch you yet. You were wrong about that, but you didn't know it then. And for those 30 seconds of descent over England, with the green fields below and the clean air around you, the world was exactly the right size again. The 101st Airborne was not like other units, and the men in it knew it and wore that knowledge the way they wore their jump boots, with a specific kind of quiet pride that didn't need to announce itself because the boots did the talking. You were assigned to Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, in the fall of 1943. And by Christmas you understood that the men around you were the most capable people you'd ever been in a room with, which was both reassuring and terrifying in equal measure. Your sergeant was a man named Kowalski, from Pittsburgh, 31 years old, who had the particular authority of someone who has stopped needing to prove anything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had a way of looking at you during a training exercise that told you exactly where you were relative to where you needed to be, without words, without drama, with a precision that you spent 8 months trying to learn and never quite managed to replicate. He said to you once, at the end of a particularly bad day on the range, "The jump is the easy part, Callahan. It's the landing that requires everything you have." You thought he meant it literally. You understand now that he meant something larger. Training was a country of its own, a place with its own language, its own geography, its own sense of time. You learned to jump, you learned to fall. You learned to assemble your weapon in darkness, by touch alone, which sounds like a small thing, until you understand that the darkness is real and the weapon is necessary, and your hands are the only thing standing between those two facts. You learn to read a map and a compass, and the behavior of other men under pressure, which is the most important map of all, and the one they don't formally teach. England, in the months before the invasion, was a strange suspension, everyone knowing something enormous was coming, no one knowing exactly when or quite what it would cost. You were billeted outside Newbury, in a requisitioned manor house that had been subdivided into barracks, and you spent the evenings playing cards and writing letters home and trying not to think too specifically about what was being planned. Your letters to your mother described the English countryside and the weather and a pub in Newbury where they served a bitter ale you'd grown to tolerate. You didn't describe the briefings or the sand table models or the aerial photographs of the Normandy coast that you'd memorized so completely you could close your eyes and walk the drop zone in your mind. You wrote to your father twice. Both letters were short. Your father was a man who respected brevity, and both said more in what they didn't say than in what they did. He wrote back once, a single paragraph on lined paper in his careful engineer's handwriting, about the mill and the weather and your sister's school results. The last sentence said, "You were always steadier than you knew." He'd never said anything like that before. You read it 4 times, folded it into your breast pocket, and carried it to England and across the Channel and into a C-47 on the night of the 5th of June, 1944. The briefing before the jump was thorough and specific, and in retrospect, optimistic in ways that the planners couldn't have known were optimistic. Drop zone marked, assembly point marked, objectives clear. You listened and understood and felt the particular calm that comes when preparation meets inevitability, when there's nothing left to do but do the thing. You checked your equipment for the last time at 2300 hours. Kowalski walked the stick, checking each man, saying nothing unnecessary. When he got to you, he looked at you for a moment, that same look from the range, calibrating, and then nodded once and moved on. You took that nod with you into the dark. The flight across the Channel was an hour and 20 minutes of cold and noise, and the particular silence of men who've run out of things to say to each other. You sat in the stick, with your equipment pressing into you from every direction, the reserve chute, the rifle, the musette bag, the grenades, all of it adding up to something close to your own body weight, which would have seemed impossible a year ago, and now just seemed like Tuesday. The man across from you, a kid from Tennessee named Beaumont, who'd turned 18 3 weeks ago, was moving his lips without sound, which might have been prayer, or might have been the words to a song, and you didn't ask, because it wasn't your business, and because you were doing something similar in your own way, which was to think about Elm Street in a very specific and deliberate sequence: the front door, the hallway, the kitchen, the smell of Sunday pot roast like a map of somewhere you needed to believe still existed. Then the flak started. The aircraft began to bank and juke, and the red light came on early, and the jump master was shouting, "Stand up, hook up," and you were doing it automatically. Your body, having learned this sequence so thoroughly, it no longer required your mind's participation. And then the green light came on, and the man ahead of you was gone, and then you were in the door, and then you were out, and the aircraft was already banking away, and the world was darkness and fire, and the sound of things you didn't have names for yet. The landing in the wrong field was the first thing. The aloneness was the second. The third was the realization, arriving slowly over the first hour of movement, that the operation was not going according to the plan you'd memorized, that the darkness was full of sounds that didn't match the briefing, that you were navigating by compass and instinct, through a country you'd never been in, toward a position you weren't sure still existed. You found Beaumont at 0300 in a ditch beside a road, his ankle broken on landing, his face showing a specific kind of controlled fear that you recognized because you were wearing the same expression. You didn't have a medic. You had a field dressing, and the knowledge that a broken ankle in Normandy on D-Day was either survivable or it wasn't, depending on factors neither of you controlled. You splinted it with 2 sticks and a strip of his jacket and told him you'd come back for him, which was either a promise or a lie, and you didn't know which yet. You found 3 more men from Easy Company by Don Kozlowski, a corporal named Pierce, and a private whose name you didn't know, but whose face you'd seen at mess in England, which was enough. 4 men instead of the company you'd trained with. You moved toward the sound of the fighting because it was the only direction that made sense and because standing still felt like a decision you couldn't afford. The hedgerows were the thing nobody had adequately explained. You'd seen them on the aerial photographs, the bocage, the French called it. Centuries of field boundaries grown into walls of earth and root and vegetation that channeled movement and eliminated sightlines and turned every field into a separate world with its own tactical problem. Moving through them was slow and exposed and exhausting. And by mid-morning, you understood that the Normandy in your mind, the one from the sand table, and the briefings and the maps you'd memorized, bore only a general relationship to the Normandy under your boots. Pierce was killed at 0940 by a single shot from a position you never located, while crossing a gap in a hedgerow that you'd assessed as clear and he'd trusted your assessment of. You didn't stop. You couldn't stop. You moved Kozlowski and the private without a name to cover, and you kept moving, and you didn't think about Pierce's assessment of the gap because that thought was a door that couldn't be opened right now, and you were very practiced by this point in keeping certain doors closed. By noon, you'd linked up with a platoon from the 82nd, which was not your unit but was American and armed and moving with purpose, and the officer in charge, a first lieutenant from Virginia named Marsh, looked at your small group and said, "Where the hell did you come from?" And you said, "Cincinnati, sir." And he looked at you for a moment, and then said, "That'll do," and incorporated you into his line of march without further discussion. You thought about Beaumont in the ditch. You thought about the promise or the lie. You kept walking. The 6th of June, 1944, lasted approximately 40 years. That's what it felt like by the time the light began to fail, and you found yourself in a farmhouse outside Saint Mère, Église, with 11 other men from 3 different units, eating cold rations from tins and listening to the sounds of the night settling into its new configuration around you. The fighting had moved and shifted and moved again throughout the day, a tide going in and out, and you'd moved with it following marsh, following the sound of where you were needed, following the basic logic of staying alive and doing the job, which had simplified itself over the course of the day into something almost elegant in its simplicity. You'd been shot at many times. You'd shot back. You didn't count. That was a kind of accounting you'd decided early in the day you weren't going to do, because the ledger would be too heavy to carry, and you still had a long way to go. In the farmhouse, a French woman, perhaps 60, with the specific dignity of someone who has made peace with the fact that history has decided to happen in her kitchen, brought out bread and set it on the table without a word, and went back to the far corner of the room where she sat in a chair and watched you all with an expression you couldn't read and still can't, which contained something that might have been relief, and something that might have been grief, and something else underneath both of those that didn't have a name in English, or presumably in French either. You ate the bread. You thought about Beaumont. At 2,100, you went back for him. This was not tactically advisable, and Lieutenant Marsh told you so directly and clearly, and then looked at you for 3 seconds and said, "Take Kozlowski and be back in 40 minutes, and that was the end of the discussion. You found Beaumont in the ditch where you'd left him, alive, feverish, his ankle worse than when you'd splinted it, but still there, still attached, still part of the same body that had crossed the channel with you 12 hours earlier. He looked up at you with the expression of someone who'd spent 9 hours deciding whether to believe in the promise or prepare for the lie, and had gone back and forth enough times that the arrival of the actual answer was almost secondary to the exhaustion of the waiting. You said, "Told you I'd come back." He said, "Yeah, you did." That was all. You carried him between you and Kozlowski, Beaumont's arms across your shoulders, his broken ankle lifted clear of the ground, back through the hedgerows in the dark, navigating by the same compass you'd been navigating by since 0130 that morning. And you delivered him to the farmhouse, where the Frenchwoman looked at his ankle and said something sharp in French and disappeared into another room and came back with things that suggested she'd done this before, or something like it, in some previous version of the war that hadn't finished with her family yet. Beaumont made it. You know this because you saw him in England 6 weeks later, walking on a cane, still from Tennessee, still 18 years old, though that last part was no longer quite accurate in any way that mattered. You kept going after June 6th. That's the part that doesn't fit neatly into the story, the fact that it didn't end, that Normandy was a beginning rather than a conclusion, that the hedgerows and the fields and the small stone villages of France were followed by Holland and Belgium and the Ardennes and a town called Bastogne, where the cold was a different kind of cold from anything Cincinnati had prepared you for, where the 101st was surrounded, and the answer to the question of whether they'd hold was written in the specific stubbornness of men who'd run up Currahee Mountain until it stopped feeling like a choice. Holland came in September, a different kind of operation, market garden, the bridges, the idea that the war might end by Christmas if everything went right. Everything didn't go right. You jumped again, this time in daylight, which was supposed to be safer, and in some ways was, and in other ways was simply a different set of problems. And you held a road for 9 days that needed to be held, and watched the larger plan come apart at the edges in ways that nobody on the ground could see clearly, and everybody could feel. You didn't lose anyone from your immediate unit in Holland, which felt like luck rather than anything you'd done. And you understood by then that luck was a category of its own that deserved respect rather than credit. Belgium was cold before Bastogne made cold mean something else. You moved through a landscape that looked like Christmas cards, snow on pine trees, stone villages with church spires, and understood for the first time that beautiful and dangerous were not opposites. The Ardennes in December was both of those things fully and simultaneously, without apology. Bastogne, you don't talk about much, even now, even in 1947, writing a letter to Beaumont. Not because it was the worst, though parts of it were, but because the language for it doesn't quite exist in the version of English spoken on Elm Street in Cincinnati. Surrounded, they told you. Reinforcements coming, they said, eventually. In between those two facts was a cold that got inside your equipment and your thinking and your sense of what you were capable of, and a stubbornness, not heroism, stubbornness. There's a difference that came from somewhere underneath all the training and the procedures and the briefings, from whatever is left of a person, when everything else has been stripped away by 3 weeks at 20 degrees below zero, with not enough ammunition and not enough food, and the absolute clarity that comes when the options reduce themselves. 2. You held. The 101st held. The relief came. These are facts that fit neatly into a sentence, which is one of the ways you know they don't capture what they're describing. You came home in September 1945. Your mother made pot roast. Your father shook your hand, the same handshake, firm and brief, and then did something he'd never done before, which was to put his other hand on top of yours and hold it there for a moment before letting go. Your sisters had grown. The street looked smaller than you remembered it, which you'd been warned about and still weren't prepared for. The mill was hiring. Everything was ordinary. Everything was waiting to be ordinary again. It took a long time, longer than people expected, and longer than you let on. Some of it came back on its own, and some of it had to be rebuilt deliberately, piece by piece, the way you'd rebuild an engine methodically, without rushing, accepting that some parts don't go back exactly where they came from. Beaumont wrote you a letter in 1947, 2 paragraphs. He was working at his father's hardware store in Tennessee. He'd married a girl from Knoxville. He said, "I think about that ditch sometimes. I think you should know that." You wrote back the same day. You said, "Me too."